Welcome to our monthly meeting, this time one that will teach us all we need to know about the Electoral College and redistricting. I know I'm looking forward to that because I know there are things I need to know about both of those. As always, the public is welcome at our meeting, so we're glad to have all of you here. And if any of you are not members, we've got a couple brochures there in the back with membership forms to fill out if you'd like to join us. I'm Claire Kelm, this year's president of the local league here in the San Juans. And for those of you who have not attended an LWV meeting before, the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization whose purpose is to promote the informed and active participation of citizens in government. As an organization, the League does not support or oppose candidates for public office, but we do advocate on those issues chosen by the membership for study and action after reaching consensus. I want to remind you of our next upcoming meeting. It is our annual meeting luncheon, and it's on May 14th at the Grange. Be watching your email that will be coming to you soon about how to make reservations. We'll be having a short business meeting where we will approve next year's budget, elect the new board, and make a small bylaws change. And our member, Patty Otley, will be the speaker. She's going to tell us about her work with Grandmothers Against Gun Violence, and you'll have to admit that is a very timely topic. Should be an especially informative event. Now I'm going to turn the meeting over to our program planners of today's meeting, and that's Laura Jo Severson and Sarah Crosby.
Thank you and welcome everybody. As many of you who know me know, I've been saying for years we have to find a way to make redistricting and gerrymandering sexy. And I include in that the Electoral College. And I would have to say that we haven't necessarily succeeded in making these topics sexy, but they are really interesting. And as both Laura Jo and I researched our respective sections, we got deeper and deeper into the weeds, and then it became hard to sift through and figure out what we should present to you and how we could sort of titillate you to do some of your own research after this. I myself came into this subject with a particular opinion about what should be done about the Electoral College. And I came away feeling differently about what I see as a solution. I will not share that with you. We're not here to advocate for any one particular position today. Rather, we saw our roles as informing you, educating you about what's out there, and the various proposals that various government and citizen entities have suggested. We've got some people trying to come in the back door. If somebody could grab it.
Somebody in the doorway over here.
Come on in.
Yeah, we've got some chairs back there. Got one up here.
Also today, we're going to present to you the League of Women Voters position, particularly on the Electoral College, and a counter-argument about that, or the source of a counter-argument about that from within the League. Our format will be such that Laura Jo is going to provide you the background about the Electoral College, its history, and how it functions. I will talk about various tweaks suggested out there to the problems that we all have seen in our Electoral College system. Then we'll have a break for questions. Feel free to ask as many questions as you wish. And then we'll move into redistricting and gerrymandering with Laura Jo, again giving the background and me suggesting or really informing you about what's out there. Regarding our PowerPoint, you are looking at two longtime League members without technical skills. So do forgive us. It's a melange of slides, which you will find hopefully amusing and informative. And also, it was our intention to present you with a bibliography, because this is a subject that many people will want to go in further as as you hear information and as you read articles in the paper. We have not yet got that completed, but we will complete it and it will go into next month's voter. So if you have any desire to research this subject fully on your own, you will have that opportunity. And with that, I'm going to give you Laura Jo, who will talk about the Electoral College.
Some of you might have woken up that morning in November and said, "Oh, soup," or some variation. And you probably remember back in the year 2000, all the furor that was very, resulted in an oh poop situation for some other people. And the Electoral colleges, we're the only country in the world that actually has something like this. It's not a popular means of electing a leader. And I picked this out, if you can, those of you in the back row may not be able to read it, but here's what looks like Alexander Hamilton explaining the Electoral College and the question being asked, are we going to be tested on this stuff? Well, we have been tested, believe me. How did we end up in this situation? That's probably the first thing that we need to talk about. In the early days, before the American Revolution and during the American Revolution, the colonies thought of themselves as little separate countries. And they were as large as many countries in Europe or other parts of the world. And when they started having problems with the government of England, they got together and formed the Continental Congress. One of the original colonies, Georgia, didn't participate because they were fighting with the Indians and they needed the support of the British Army. But the rest got together and organized the first Continental Congress, which met in 1774. And they basically put together a little basic government that had a Congress, and each state, each colony had one representative, no matter how large or how small. There wasn't a court system, there wasn't a president. It was just the president, the leader of the Congress, which was called he was called the president of the Congress. He's going to pop up here in a minute. The Second Continental Congress met a year later, and by then they were already fighting with the British, and so they appointed George Washington as the commander of the army. And after the war ended, they found themselves with some serious problems. One, they didn't have anybody to settle discussions between the states, and almost had some war break out. And they didn't have the money to pay the revolutionary soldiers. And they had a little thing called Shays' Rebellion, which is where a group of former members of the Revolutionary Army went and demanded that they be paid. So they decided that they should come up with a better solution. So they all got together and they wrote the Articles of Confederation. Well, the problem with this was the same as they'd had before. They didn't have one person in charge, they didn't have an executive branch, and they didn't have judges. They just had the representatives from the different states, and each one of them only had, a little state like New Jersey had one vote, just like a big state, population-wise, Virginia had one vote. So that didn't work out very well. And they couldn't raise money. They had to ask states for it. And if you think about what would happen now if we did that, since we're all thinking about taxes. And its leader of the Continental Congress was technically the president, and it didn't work very well. Now, I'm a big trivia, fan, and if anybody ever asks you if George Washington was the first president, we had 10 presidents before. They were people who were elected each year as the president of the Congress. And some of the names you might recognize, but I'm not going to test you on it. Okay, the Continental Congress was called in the convention to write some improvements to the Articles of Confederation. And so again, they met each time in what had originally been the State House of the colony and then the state of Pennsylvania. Well, this is now known as Constitution Hall. Some of you may have been there. I'm looking forward to going there one day. And they were concerned about having pressure put on them, so they literally locked the doors and closed the windows. And this was in the summer. They met for 4 months, and you can imagine how hot it must have been. Well, they didn't want reporters hanging around trying to overhear, and they didn't want someone to go out and be interviewed. So they agreed that nobody would take notes and there wouldn't be any record published until they finished the whole thing. And they went through a lot of discussion about how to do stuff. They finally came up with the idea of having 3 branches of government, having a legislative branch, which was like they were already doing under the Articles of Confederation, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And each one of these groups was selected in a different way. The legislative branch was elected by the people, the judicial branch was appointed, and the executive branch was elected. So they all balanced, they were all elected at a different time in a different fashion, and they all had a certain amount of power over the other branches. So it worked out fairly well. It took a couple of years to get the Constitution approved. They had made the decision early on that they were not going to improve the Articles of Confederation. They were going to write something new. This was pretty controversial at the time because they didn't know that they had this power or not. A lot of what we know about the writing of the Constitution is based on James Madison's notes. Even though he was told not to take notes, he did and kept a diary. And he may have edited it to change, saying, well, this was all my work, or to change what decision was made. But it's used largely as the record of what happened with the writing of the Constitution. He later, I hadn't been particularly impressed by Mr. Madison until I started reading this, but he later went on and became the 4th President of the United States. Now, one of the big things they discussed that was probably the hardest was how to base representation for the legislative branch. They decided there should be a bicameral legislature, meaning 2 houses, like they have in England and other places. They created the House of Representatives, which was to be based on population, be divided up in districts that were somewhat equal. And then to have the Senate now, for up until 1911, the senators were selected by the legislators in each house. And they used to call it the Millionaires Club for that reason, because there were some pretty interesting people that got to be senators, mainly because they had a lot of money and a lot of influence that way, or because they were the friend of the governor or somebody like that. But that was how the legislature was designed. Every 10 years, they said that we should have a census, and we're coming up on one in 2020. And the census was mainly designed to find out how many people each state had so that they could determine what kind of representation they would have. And after each 10-year census, then the states are required to determine how their districting is going to be. After the 2010 census, the state of Washington gained one more representative. And the states that either lose population or don't gain as fast lose a representative. And the state is left up with how to, to distribute things. This is going to be addressed when we talk about redistricting and when we talk about the gerrymandering problem. Some states allow their legislature to decide how to redistrict. Other states, like Washington, I think, because we sort of have a higher value of fair play, just an opinion there, sorry. Anyway,
You forget it.
our state allowed a commission that was made up of an equal number of Republicans and Democrats and a neutral person to decide how our additional representative would be, where that would be placed. And it is fairly accurate in the sense of, following county lines and natural boundaries and so forth. But not everybody does that. One thing that is interesting, I always wondered about this, because the Constitution says that the House of Representatives should represent a certain percentage, a certain number of people. And they kept adding seats as the population of the country grew. Well, they finally, in 1911, they realized they didn't have any more places to put chairs in the Capitol building, so they capped the number of representatives at 435. There was nothing magic about it. That was just where they ran out of room. And since then, it's been a case of moving the number of representatives around. And like I said, if you lost population, you lost a representative. If you gained population, you gained a representative. Now, how does this fit in? How does the Electoral College fit in here? Well, basically, when they set up the Electoral College, the writers of the Constitution didn't exactly trust the common man, and they didn't have they didn't have access to a lot of communications to find out who some of the good candidates were. So they decided they would create a thing called the Electoral College. And they divided up how the Electoral College would be selected by saying each state would get the number of Electoral College members equal to how many congressmen they had, how many members of the House of Representatives they had, plus the 2 senators. But no state was to have fewer than 3 representatives on the Electoral College. And you'll think about that for a while when we talk on about it. They ran into a little problem. Things went out, all right, everybody wanted George Washington for the first president. Then they went to John Adams. And then they came up in the election of 1796, and they started having an emergence of of political parties. And so Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, which kind of sounds like a funny name, but this is where the present Democratic Party, says they came from. And the federal, John Adams was a Federalist. And they had set this up so that when the Electoral College voted, whoever got the most ballots was president, and whoever got second most ballots was vice president. And these guys didn't particularly agree. As the Adams term continued after about the first year, Congress passed what is called the Alien and Sedition Act, which said basically that you couldn't say anything bad about the president. Can you imagine? Think about that. You can probably come up with some alternative history things here, you know, and think what would have happened. But when this was passed, there were several newspaper editors that were jailed. And poor old Thomas Jefferson was not happy with that. So when he became president, after Adams, he pardoned these newspaper editors and let them out of jail. So that was one of his first moves here. Well, in the election of 1800, there were 4 candidates running, and the top 2 tied. They each had an equal number of votes. One of them was Thomas Jefferson, and the other was Aaron Burr. I think probably you've heard of him. But so it went to the House of Representatives. One of the rules about the electors, if they cannot come up with a majority to agree on the president, it's settled by the House of Representatives. And so this went to the House of Representatives, and they had 4 people, and the top 2 were Burr and Thomas Jefferson. And they voted for over 30 times and couldn't come up with something. And finally, this is something I didn't know until we started researching this, the governors of Pennsylvania and Virginia threatened to march their militias on the Capitol if they didn't select Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson became the third president, and Mr. Burr was his vice president. So after this fiasco, they decided that maybe we should do something to sort of smooth that out. And it was smoothed out by the 12th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment was passed by Congress and was approved by all the majority of the states in a fairly short time, because they realized they had kind of made a mistake with this president and vice president business. So it set up that if there wasn't a clear majority, the House of Representatives would select from the top 3 candidates, and then the Senate would choose the vice president. Now, how many of you remember 1968? Okay. 1968 was a rough year with a lot of assassinations, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Lyndon Johnson was running against Hubert Humphrey. Well, there's a guy named George Wallace who was from my home state. Well, George was kind of, you know, what he was like. Anyway, he ran on the American Independence Party, and it turned out he ended up getting 45 electoral votes because he had votes from 5 states. And his campaign literature and the things he said that he wanted to have nobody have a majority, and then he was going, and then it would be, the election would be decided by the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives would from each state would only have 1 vote, and that would, if he thought he was going to get a lot more votes than he did, that would have allowed him to have been elected. So, you know, think about that one for a while. But we go on. We have the 12th Amendment in power. And what happened, I don't know if you know about the election of 1824. That was kind of an exciting year, too. Andrew Jackson, who was a military hero, among other things, ran against John Quincy Adams. And Jackson got more electoral votes and more popular votes. But he didn't have a clear majority, so there were 4 candidates then. So the 12th Amendment took away, said it's just the House of Representatives would select from the top 3. So the 4th guy was a fellow named Henry Clay, excuse me, who you might have heard of. But Henry decided, he went and talked with all the other, all the members of the House of Representatives and said, if you're supported, if you'll throw your support toward John Quincy Adams. And so they did, and in exchange, he became Secretary of State, which is the most powerful of the cabinet members. Now, you can think about if that's ever happened in our recent history, but and then again, we get up to 1876, and this was a time the Civil War was over and the South was still under military rule. And a fellow named Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat, won more electoral and popular votes, but several of the states down in the South, and interestingly, Oregon, I don't know why they did this, but southern states sent two delegations for their electors. And the rest of this again had to be decided by the House of Representatives. And they appointed a commission, which, what they did is finally they said, well, we're going to support Rutherford B. Hayes. I don't know if you've heard of him or not. But anyway, Mr. Hayes, who became the president after an agreement was made with Mr. Tilden, that they would end Reconstruction and take the armies out of the former Confederate states. So I don't know whether everybody was happy or not, but it worked out. Mr. Hayes agreed that he was going to run, he was only going to serve one term, which was, he thought was a fair deal. All right, then we get the next election that this is messed up. This happened in 1888 when this happened in 1888 when Mr. Grover Cleveland was president. And he ran, and it happened that he got all the little states votes, but he ran against a guy named Benjamin Harrison, who got the big states votes. And so he left. And as they were checking out, he did not get reelected. And as they were leaving the White House, his wife told all the staff and servants to take care of things as they were coming back. So, trivia question here, Mr. Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He was elected again in 1892. So we go for a century. Nobody had a problem with the process until the 2000 election. And Al Gore received 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, but he came down to the state of Florida, as you recall, because there was question about the ballots, and they went for weeks trying to decide what to do. Anybody remember what those ballots?
The hanging chad.
Nobody, think about stuff from our lifetime. That's going to be a thing we really will remember. But they started a recount because there was questions about particularly a district that went one way when everybody said no, they voted the other way. Anyway, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the recount should stop, and that made Mr. George W. president. And then recently, 2016, we had Hillary Clinton, who won nearly 3 million more votes than her opponent. And but the way the distribution of the Electoral College went, he won and she didn't. Now, how can this happen again? We have a total of 538 members of the Electoral College. Since the 12th Amendment came out, we have added, the District of Columbus has 3 electoral votes also. And if a candidate could win just the following 11 states by extremely narrow margins, he or she could become president even if she failed to get a single vote in any other states. But these are 11 states that their total electoral votes would add up to 720. And we have a situation where in all but 2 of the states, the person who wins the majority of the vote in that state gets all of the electoral votes, even though there might be 49% for one and 51% for the other. The state of California population is larger than the 21 smallest states plus the District of Columbia combined. They have 55 electoral votes, and the above-mentioned states, who each have at least 3 votes, 3 electoral votes, add up to 95. So it's, if you vote in Wyoming, your vote counts a lot stronger than if you vote in California. Now, Mr. Bush received all of the Florida votes in 2000. Mr. Bush received all of the Florida votes in 2000, even though he got only 500 more actual votes. And Mr. Gore received all of California's votes, even though Bush won 43%. In the 2016 election, candidates spent most of their time and money in only 14 states. And 36 states with 2/3 of the population were pretty much ignored. And their issues weren't discussed, and votes didn't really count that much, and many voters in non-battleground states didn't vote. If I still lived in Alabama and I wanted to vote, had wanted to vote for a Democratic candidate, I might stay home that day because, I figured out it wouldn't count. And then in 2016, 58% of registered voters didn't vote. Now, the Constitution doesn't make electors vote for their pledged candidates. They have had over the years 160, I'll find that, look at my notes here.
It's on the slide, Roger.
Okay, thank you. There have been 163 faithless electors who have voted against who they've said they were going to vote for. I mean, sometimes they do it for good reason. One person didn't vote because he thought that George Washington should be the only one who received 100% of the Electoral College. Let me move up here. After the 2016 election, there was a movement to get some of the electors to vote either for somebody else or to vote for Hillary Clinton. And in fact, several electors actually did vote. There were 2 in Texas who voted for the governor of Ohio, John Kasich. Kasich. I want to say Kasich, yes, anyway, thank you, you're all paying attention. All right. We didn't have anybody that changed, and anybody who was a pledged Republican vote for a Democrat in that election. And the next part is turned over to Sarah. Thank you for that background, Mr. Sergio.
50% of the voters didn't vote.
That's right.
All right, I said I would give you the league position on the Electoral College. And for those of you who can't read this, it says, the League of Women Voters of the United States believes that the direct popular vote method for electing the president and vice president is essential to representative government. The League of Women Voters of the United States believes, therefore, that the Electoral College should be abolished. We support the use of the National Popular Vote Compact until the abolition of the Electoral College is accomplished. So there you have what the League says. But there are a lot of other thinkers, government officials, pundits who think differently. I do want to say that many of you know that the League process for forming a position is a very long and arduous process. Each local league is consulted on issues. The states collate the opinions of local leagues, and that's submitted to the National League, which then discusses and passes at the National Convention any position which the League then uses to advocate before Congress. So the fact that they came out very definitively about their opinions about the Electoral College is significant. However, as much as many entities admire the League, there is a lot of dissent out there with regard to that position. I thought that it would be useful to give a definition of federalism, because ours is a federal form of a democracy, which means that our country is is governed on two different levels. We have the national government, and then we have the state and local entities. So we have a multi-tiered system. David, did you have a question?
Well, I was going to ask you to define the position of the compact. In the previous slide, you said that
I'm sorry, I'm going to get to that and talk specifically about the compact in a minute, and I should have let you know that. It's useful for you to know about federalism because it was very intentionally set up this way by the Founding Fathers. In order to minimize the tyranny of the majority, they wanted to be sure that all parts of the country would be represented at the national level. So what do? Do we tweak or do we throw it out? Those advocating for tweaks have come up with several creative thoughts. As Joe mentioned, both Nebraska and Maine do not have winner-take-all policies or allotments for their electoral votes. They have what's known as the congressional district method. And in this, the winner of each congressional district is given one electoral vote, and then the winner of the overall popular vote within that state is given the two electoral votes that would normally or that represent the Senate. The advantage, or some of the pros and cons of taking on this system on a nationwide basis is that state legislatures each would have to approve changes to how their electors are currently allocated. An advantage to this is that no constitutional amendment would be required because all of the work of switching to this form of allotment of electors would be done at the legislative level. It would retain the Electoral College if you think that that is the way that that the country needs to go. But if all of the states don't go to this method, then you have some states with particularly high allotments of electoral votes who could then have an undue amount of influence on the results of the election. And I'm speaking specifically about Texas with 38 electoral votes and California with 55. So there you have it. And going on to the national popular vote, I want to go back for just a moment to the congressional district method. Interestingly enough, in my research, it turns out that empirical evidence shows that in Nebraska and Maine, with only two exceptions, in 2008 and 2016, This method of allocating electoral votes has resulted in the statewide winners sweeping all the electoral votes. So opponents of this particular method suggest that these races become less competitive. I think it has to do with human nature. Let's see. Another alternative to the Electoral College is the National Popular Vote Compact, and many of you have probably heard and read about this already. And this compact says that states that sign on, as it says up here, agree that the winner nationally gets all of their electoral votes. And the goal is to get enough states to sign on to this compact to represent a total of 270 electoral votes. As of now, 11 states are representing, have signed on, and they are Rhode Island, Vermont, Hawaii, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, Washington, New Jersey, Illinois, New York, and California. Several other states have passed the compact in one or another of their legislative houses, but have not yet moved on to the other house. Excuse me. This total of these 11 states represent 165 electors, so they have only 105, sorry, electors yet to find. The pros and cons of this. It could retain the Electoral College. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment to go to this method of allocation. However, what people aren't as aware of is that the word compact is actually a legal term. And a compact in law says, or the compact clause in the Constitution says, that it prohibits one state from entering into a compact with another state without the consent of Congress. So the national popular vote could run into a snag where the number of states has actually been achieved for representing 270 electoral votes. But if Congress doesn't approve that compact, we go nowhere. That was news to me.
Sarah?
Yes?
So the 165 or whatever the number is that
That are currently committed.
They're committed, but on the condition that eventually additional states get added and it gets up to 270. I mean, they're not going to follow that procedure unless, and that's the compact in effect that they're making.
Right, that they do this together.
They do it together. I mean, if
they really have no power unless they can achieve this 270 votes.
Right.
And then, as we've discovered, or as I've discovered, but then Congress has to approve that.
It's wishful thinking, obviously, but if they just individually just said, we're going to do it, we don't care what anybody else does, we're just going to do it. If there were enough states following that rationale, it wouldn't be a compact, and therefore it could be passed.
That's right.
Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
Or I believe that's right. I can't speak legally here. All right, for those who just flat out want to get rid of the Electoral College, you probably all learned this in school, but you need 2/3 of approval of both houses of Congress, plus the approval of 3/4 of the state legislatures. That's 38 states. Or they have to convene a constitutional convention, which would require that 2/3 of the state legislatures agree to a constitutional convention. So what defeats so many efforts to basically to get rid of the Electoral College is the arduous process that we have to go through. And we've all lived through a constitutional amendment and the requirement to approve the amendments. Something as monumental as getting rid of the Electoral College is just that much more complicated. And there are many people, both legislators and academicians, who feel that Electoral College is actually, it's an emblem, it's emblematic of our federalist system of government. And to get rid of it, rather than to tweak it, is basically taking away the form of democracy that we have. And ours is the only democracy that is formed in this particular way. You note that there are lots of democracies throughout the world, that they've all chosen parliamentary systems or other forms of government other than our own, possibly because it's so hard to understand. Instant runoff voting is another very popular idea in this country for reducing the effects of the Electoral College, or a good excuse for getting rid of the Electoral College. It's also known as ranked choice voting, and I think there are several other names, but these are the two that you see most often in print. Individual states could use it, or we could do it on a national basis. The way it works, briefly, is that voters are asked to rank the candidates on the ballot according to their preference. So if you have 4 candidates, you'd rank first, second, third, and fourth choice. If no candidate receives an outright majority, in which case he or she would win the election, then the person receiving the least votes would be eliminated from the race. And keep in mind, everybody has ranked their preferences. So the first choice, the ballots that voted for the losing candidate, the one who's being eliminated, would then be recounted using their second choice. And those choices would be allocated among the remaining candidates. And this process would be repeated if there was still not a clear majority, with the candidate receiving the least votes being eliminated and those ballots being reallocated. So it's a fairly straightforward method of achieving several important goals, which the most important of which is one man, one vote. Every vote would be counted, and in finding the majority. One of the major arguments for going to instant runoff voting is that it eliminates the need for both primary elections and for runoff elections. So basically, it could be cheaper. However, and also every vote counts. And the other very important element of that is it gives easy entree for additional parties to form and be part of the governmental process and dialogue. The cons of the instant runoff voting are that the process of educating the voting public on instant runoff voting is long and arduous. And nobody can speak to that more strongly than Tom Munsey, who has been advocating for this for all of the years that I've known him. And it was only until I actually sat down and went through the process myself that I finally understood it. It is a difficult concept to grab once we're so used to our own system. Also, another important thing is the cost of upgrading our equipment. We're having trouble upgrading our voting equipment with the system we have. To have to buy all new machines or the software to convert those machines to being able to tally instant runoff vote ballots would be, at this point, probably prohibitive. It's not a deal breaker necessarily, but it would take a very deliberate conversation in order to do that. And then, as I mentioned before, there's just the long process of eliminating the Electoral College. And that would probably have to be done first. Tom?
If anybody's interested, I have a little PowerPoint presentation I can send you that has the Muppets and Miss Piggy especially doing IRB.
Actually, if you would send it to me when
All
I
right.
do the post-meeting blurb and send it to Claire and to Marty for the voter, we could distribute that to people, because I spent a lot of time watching YouTube videos of people explaining instant runoff voting and a number of other things that we'll talk about here today. And some of them are a real giggle, some of them are very informative in a very simple, straightforward way, but it's, the wide variety is really quite interesting. You have a question?
I'd like to caution against the notion, which I hear a lot, that new systems of counting votes would be expensive. I think it's mostly because it would be proprietary, and it could be a government-owned thing. I could be wrong, but I think that these voting machines are basically, or whatever method you use, they're glorified calculators. You know, they don't need to have incredibly sophisticated software. Especially if it was government-owned and not private. I think that we should consider that new voting systems and ones that are verifiable with a paper trail are very doable and not an obstacle to democracy.
Well, and also, there are other countries who use instant runoff voting. There are states that use instant runoff voting as well. So they've obviously solved some of these problems. The enormous expense of doing it nationally would have to be balanced against probably the normal expense of having to upgrade machines. And there are a number of our voting machines which have been judged to be outdated already. So I think your point's a really good one.
Yeah, let's save our questions till at the end, and then we'll use the time that we have available.
Okay, and the other obvious alternative is just a straight popular vote, which many people do advocate for. Eliminate the Electoral College, however long that would take, every vote would count, and it would possibly encourage a higher voter turnout. However, the very real possibility as more parties form, and it's not a given that more parties would form, but it's probably fairly logical that they would be that we could have an election resulting in a plurality rather than a majority, which would then necessitate a runoff or some other tweak that has yet to be decided or thought about. And I keep putting expense in there because I think given today's news of our deficit going up and any number of ways in which states struggle, this is something that we do have to think about in our analysis. So those are a few thoughts about what we might do about the Electoral College, either tweak it or throw it out. And we have a scheduled break here for people to ask questions if there are any more. Susie?
What are the announced postures of the official organizations of the Republican and Democratic parties on this issue?
I don't know.
Don't know, I have some stuff I'll share with you later, if that's okay.
Good question.
Yeah,
David?
there's a book about that.
I'm sure, I don't expect you all to know for sure, but somebody probably here does. When was the last time we actually successfully amended the Constitution? What?
Here in a while.
When was the last time we actually successfully amended our Constitution?
It was the one,
terms for office for president after FDR.
After,
Because the
that's it,
rights
isn't it?
amendment.
Because I can't remember one of my lifetime.
actually, that was the next to the last. The last one was when they allowed a person to be appointed as vice president. That gave us Gerald Ford. He became vice president because after Mr. Agnew went home, or wherever he went.
Is that a constitutional?
That was a constitutional amendment, yes, and you might know more, yes.
I appreciate the fact that Sarah said that there's a cost, but I think that in our lifetimes, we've seen enough failure of machines that may or may not have thrown elections, we don't entirely know, and that some value has to be assigned to cleaning that mess up if one of these can.
Right. I quite agree with that.
Yeah.
Susie, I want to double check with you. You wanted the positions of the Republicans and Democrats on the Electoral College?
Yeah, on
Okay.
whether it should be tweaked or eliminated, or whether they love it.
Okay, I will get that and get back to you, and I'll also put it in my wrap-up notes for the voters, people who are interested in that question. Are there other questions about this section? In that case, Laura Jo is going to take back over and talk a little bit about redistricting and gerrymandering.
Good job, Sarah.
Okay, give me a second here. We know about redistricting. The state legislatures in each state are the ones that are responsible for doing redistricting based on the 10-year census. And we've had some discussion in the news recently about some states wanting to add a citizenship question, and some people saying that that might discourage people from answering the census. I don't know if you remember when the censuses were done, but back sometime in the 60s, I remember there was a rumor going around that it was being used for some nefarious purpose, like deciding where all the Republicans lived or where all the Democrats lived. And one of my neighbors refused to answer it. So the census is a pretty controversial thing to a lot of people. So particularly with the idea of who gets to redistrict. They came up with an idea many years ago, back in the 18th century, that you could arrange how a vote would go by how you districted, how you set up a district. Some of you might remember Dennis Kucinich. Remember him? He was a congressman, kind of fun to have around, and his district was redone, and it eliminated a large population area that had supported him and moved it over into another district. So when he ran in 2012, he didn't get elected. Now, there are 4 different kinds of ways we learned of how to do gerrymandering. You can do it by hijacking, which puts politicians from the same party who had previously represented different districts into the same district, so they have to run against each other. And kidnapping moves an incumbent politician's voter base to another district, which is what happened to poor Mr. Kucinich. Cracking takes a group of voters and spreads them out across several districts to influence their, to dilute their influence. And packing means to put all of the people of one's, in one color or of one persuasion into a particular district so that they can't influence. Now, the term gerrymandering comes from a governor of Massachusetts named Elbridge Gerry. And so he and his friends in the legislature drew a map of a district that looked like this. And they decided it looked like a salamander. And that's where the term came from, gerrymandering. I always wondered about that. Anyway, that term's been used all along. It didn't really become as much of a problem until recently, when we came up with things like computers and map drawing and ways to track where votes are. You could take, for instance, San Juan County or the San Juan Island and put a dot all over, a red dot for the Republicans and a blue dot for the Democrats, and put them around, and then you could figure out if you wanted to divide them up into an area where you could concentrate all of your voters in one district, or you could split a voters district or something. So dangerous map makers is actually what we deal with, because there are lots of computer programs. There's a program I'll post with some of our other stuff, a game you can play where you actually move stuff around and see how you can change the outcome of a vote. This is, most recently, we've we've heard there's several cases, some going before the Supreme Court, about gerrymandered districts. This is a map of the Pennsylvania congressional districts as they were in 2016. And recently, the state Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And they had to redraw it so that the districts were somewhat balanced and equal in size and in population. And if you'll recall, recently, the state legislature tried to do what to the Supreme Court? They filed impeachment charges against him. That, they were told that couldn't happen. I'm glad that didn't. All right, this is a map I thought you might want to see of the state of Washington in our districts, which were done by a committee with equal representation. And it still looks a little funny, but it follows the district line, the lines of the different counties and the natural borders like rivers and so forth. This would be an example of how a gerrymandered state would be, where you could come back and forth.
You might want to explain that graphic you just.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is one of your graphics you want to explain. This is a copy of a big rectangular state where you had 60 blue, 60 Democratic districts and 40% red districts. And the way it's spread around. Now it's your turn.
Okay.
Well, no, just tell me about this, and then I'll do my last two slides.
Well, there are two different ways to look at it. It's a 5-district state, and if the lines are drawn this way, horizontally, it ends up with 5 blue districts because they dominate in each state. However, if the lines are drawn a different way, it ends up with 3 red and 2 blue. And the actual distribution of the state's votes are 60% blue and 40% red. So this was done simply with a computer model, and given whatever parameters are put in, the computers can draw lines pretty much any way anybody wishing to change the flow of votes wants. So I think this is a nice straightforward graphic demonstrating what we're saying. Go ahead.
No, it's your turn now.
Okay.
Get out to your point.
Okay.
You're number 42.
I am. Okay, given that, where are we? The Supreme Court had said some time ago that racial gerrymandering was constitutionally suspect. I love the generic terms. But it has, until fairly recently, been reluctant to weigh in on partisan gerrymandering. And part of the reasoning that I have gathered in my reading is, and one of the most important reasons is, that there are as yet no clear standards set by the court or really at the federal level for what would constitute gerrymandering as opposed to redistricting with a slight bias. And the court, as you can imagine, may be reluctant to be accused of partisan ruling, and virtually anything that the Supreme Court does now, they're accused of partisan action, no matter which side the decision falls on. And there is the possibility of a flood of possible cases once clear guidelines are established, but of course now there is a flood of cases because there aren't the guidelines established and everybody's giving it a shot. Until recently, I just thought these were a couple of interesting little factoids. The last time a case of political gerrymandering made it all the way to the Supreme Court was 2004. And that was a case from Pennsylvania, Veith v. Jubileer. And that decision was split and upheld a district court ruling saying that a political gerrymandering was not unconstitutional, interestingly enough. However, times have changed with the hyperpartisanship and the computer technology that both Laura Jo and I have referred to. But there are some recent cases that are worth discussing a little bit more in depth. And bear with me, I'm not a judicial or a legal mind, but I'll try and stick strictly to the facts. Anybody who's better versed on these cases than I, feel free to speak up. In this particular case, Common Cause versus Rucho, there is one interesting little sidebar, which is that originally the League of Women Voters had filed suit against Rucho, as had Common Cause. And at some point in the process, the two cases were combined. But the League of Women Voters is, because this is always a question of one person, one vote, the League at the national level and at the state level is very vigilant about what's going on in our states. And I have some interesting information about our local league, Washington League, shortly. So the league was active in this case. The issue was partisan bias of newly redrawn districts after the previously redrawn map, which had been done in the aftermath of the 2010 census. That map had been struck down as being racial gerrymandering. So the state went back to work and decided to engage in political gerrymandering instead. A three-panel federal court refused Rucho's motion to dismiss the case, after which the defendants filed a motion to stay any decision until the Supreme Court had ruled on Gill versus Whitford, which is pending from Wisconsin. In January of this year, the federal court struck down the most recent redrawing of the district maps, citing unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. And in that same month, the defendants filed an emergency motion to stay the redrawing of the remedial map, again pending the decisions of both Gill versus Whitford and Benesek versus Lamone. That motion was also denied. However, shortly after that ruling, the defendants filed an emergency motion before the Supreme Court of the U.S. requesting a stay pending the results of these two cases, and that stay was granted. And the reason I spelled that out is that every one of these cases is so complicated. There are avenues of remedy to every ruling, it seems, until the cases make it to, until and if the cases make it to the Supreme Court. So that case is pending. Karen?
My understanding is that these two, one of the interesting things about these two cases is that one is a gerrymandering favoring Republicans and the other is a gerrymandering favoring Democrats. And
right.
That puts a challenge, an extra impetus to the Supreme Court to not vote in a partisan way because
right.
However they decide is going to affect both parties. I thought that was interesting.
Right. And I was just going to address that. That's okay. That's okay. You obviously have been paying attention, and I'm counting on you to correct me if I make any misstatements here. The next case is in the state of Wisconsin, Gill versus Whitford, which was heard in October of 2017. And that case, let's see, in November of 2016, a three-judge panel from Wisconsin's district court determined that the redrawn state assembly district map, so we're talking about an issue of redistricting of the state assembly districts rather than the congressional districts. was adopted by the Wisconsin legislature in 2011, and it had been done with unconstitutional partisan intent. The result of the redrawing was such that although Republicans gained 60% of the seats in the 2012 election, they received only 49% of the votes. And the results were similar in the 2014 election. So the effects of the redrawing of those maps were seen very clearly. The state of Wisconsin filed their appeal to that ruling in February of 2017, and in June of 2017, the Supreme Court of the U.S. agreed to hear that case. So that, again, is pending. Then in Maryland, Benesek versus Limone, that was just heard a couple of weeks ago. That case was filed in November 2013, challenging the congressional redistricting map, which was passed into law by the Maryland General Assembly, again, after the 2010 census. In April of 2014, a district court judge dismissed the case for failure to state a claim, which I have learned means, in law, failure to provide sufficient facts which would indicate that a case is valid. The judge did not, however, convene a 3-judge panel. Shortly after that, a U.S. Court of Appeals affirmed the lower court's decision, and so the plaintiffs turned around and appealed to the Supreme Court of the U.S. In December of 2015, the Supreme Court rejected the lower court's ruling, citing the necessity in law of convening a 3-judge panel. And I believe it was Justice Alito who spoke out on that. Then ensued a period of back and forth motions, and there were too many to bore you all with. But in late August of 2016, the district stayed any further proceedings pending the Supreme Court decision in Gill versus Whitford. The next day, the plaintiffs filed an appeal to the Supreme Court to review a decision by the district court not to prohibit the use of the redrawn map. Yes, a lower court had prohibited the use of the redrawn map in any future elections, but the plaintiffs decided they would like to use the map until such time as the Supreme Court made a ruling. However, that was, does anybody know how that came out? I think that was turned down.
Didn't it get joined to Gill versus Gill?
Pardon?
Didn't the Maryland case get joined to Gill versus Gill?
I haven't read anything about that. They were heard separately. I believe they're going to be ruled on separately. But you've read something that they've been joined?
I could easily be wrong. I thought they did.
Okay, well, all of these cases are pending, and we should hear in the next couple of months what the outcome is. And you talked a bit about Pennsylvania, so I'll move on from that. But the important point here is that what's missing is a set of standards by which courts can rule on these cases of gerrymandering. And one of the terms that's used by people who are analyzing the problems of trying to mitigate gerrymandering is called an efficiency gap. And the efficiency gap is a mathematical model that may become a standard for measuring gerrymandering. It measures how many wasted votes each candidate received in a particular election. And this measure, the discussion of the efficiency gap, was used in the argument in the Wisconsin case, Gill versus Whitford. So that may well be a term that you're going to be wanting to look for when you read about the results of these cases. So what to do? Many things possible. But two of the things that I have read about that have been proposed are to use proportional representation or the alternative vote system. Proportional representation is basically as they do in a parliamentary democracy. And these are used in a number of countries beyond our borders: Israel, Germany, Finland, New Zealand, and Sweden, to name a few. In this, candidates are included on a party list, and seats are allocated according to the percentage of votes that the party gets in the election. The parties have listed all the candidates in an order of their own preference, and so as many seats as they are allocated, that many candidates then go on to represent the appropriate district. Also, there is the alternative vote system, which is used in Ireland and Australia, and each state is considered a district. The individual candidates run for the number of seats allocated to that state, presumably the same number as currently are assigned to the state, and candidates would be ranked by voters, and a formula would establish which candidates are seated. These alternatives are complicated to explain and to carry out, but the plus of them is that they make the whole idea of district boundaries much less important. Each state would become its own district. The larger states like Texas or California might have several districts within them, but the vast majority of the states would have a single district. So that changes the situation substantially. The benefit of that, of course, is obvious. The candidates are then encouraged to travel the entire state, to become known in the entire state. Right now we're dealing with the flyover states that get no attention at all. We're also dealing with states such as Texas and California with their high electoral college count being totally ignored because one is decidedly and historically Republican, as the other is decidedly and historically Democratic. And Laura Jo mentioned a couple of statistics, but basically the majority of 2016 presidential campaign events took place in a total of 11 states. So the idea that we would be knowing intimately the people who represent us at the presidential level is ludicrous. Why all of this matters? I think you all have your own opinions, and I'll give you some that I have gathered and some that I feel as well. We've got partisan thinking, we've got hyper-partisanship in our country. We demonize the sides who oppose us. It's undermining the institutions which are fundamental to our system of democracy, such as the separation of powers, the media, and the courts. As faith in the courts becomes a target, their rulings on issues such as gerrymandering are called into question, expanding the cynicism with which our institutions are viewed. It influences the outcomes of our elections because as partisanship becomes more about the party and power than about representing the legislative wishes of the electorate as a whole. And I'm thinking in terms of gun legislation right now, where a majority of Americans want certain kinds of gun legislation, but there has been no action in so many years on the things that seem to be popular with the American electorate. And this compromises our democracy. People don't feel that their vote counts, so they don't vote. The concentration of power in one party, one institution, or one person goes against what the Founding Fathers were trying to achieve. That's something that we have to be very careful about. We all think it can't happen here, but I wonder. As League of Women Voters members and interested parties, we do believe in one person, one vote. We believe in a representative democracy. We see the barriers to voting proliferating and the ways in which elections can be skewed because of these barriers. And as we see gerrymandered districts which essentially nullify the votes of residents who are not members of the dominant party in that district. Leagues across the country are informed and vigilant and willing to take to court the flagrant cases of efforts to deny people the vote or to skew the vote by using the mandated redistricting process. Our work is ongoing and multifaceted. Staying informed and being willing to use our voices is essential to helping the public understand both the problems we face and the wide array of choices we have to remedy the consequences of outdated election provisions and intended corruption of our electoral institutions. Are there any questions? David?
Two questions. One was about this several different methods of electing or selecting the district representatives. Could individual states change how they do it, or does it require a national decision so that it applies to all states equally? We mentioned the examples of Australia and other states, other countries. Yeah. Would it have to be done nationwide, or could the state of Washington decide on its own, we're going to adopt a couple different methods?
I believe we could.
Yeah,
It's a
because,
legislative decision.
Okay.
How individual states allocate their electoral votes are, is a
Not
state
electable, I'm
decision.
talking, for selecting.
For representatives.
Yeah, how they elect them, okay. The second question is, we have a census coming up in 2020. Is the implementation of the results of that census by individual states, however they do it, with commissions and all that, is that going to play out in time to have an influence on the 2020 presidential elections, or is it going to, it's going to be drawn out, even without court challenges, it's going to be drawn out and it won't have any impact on 2020?
Anything that's going to be done to affect the 2020 presidential election has to be done now.
Yeah.
And, you know.
Well, I'm talking about just
play out
the
before.
census, just the result of the census, it
No.
won't impact 2020 at all.
Right.
Okay.
Any other questions for Joe or me? Beverly, sorry.
Yes. I'm staying in contact with Texas, of course, and they have been trying election after election after election to gerrymander my neighbor out of the Senate, and they have never been able to do it. Do you know?
I read about
Lloyd
that,
Dogger.
yeah.
Lloyd Dogger, yeah.
Actually, they kept moving the boundary, and he moved several times, and finally he said, heck, and he stayed where he was, but he still keeps being
Because
reelected.
he's honest.
Yeah.
He's about the only honest one.
I understand,
But we didn't hear that here, right?
I didn't say anything.
but that, you know, happens a lot, that, you know, people get their district moved, and happened in my own home state as well, but the person didn't get elected, even though they lived out the district. It's one of the things you think about. There's no limit to how long you've lived in a district, whether you've been elected. Anybody remember, or back when I mentioned Dennis Kucinich, when there was some discussion about asking him to move to Orcas Island and run for Congress from the 2nd Legislative District? Well, he didn't move, and probably Rick Larson was glad of that, but when Robert Kennedy and Hillary Clinton each moved to New York State and had not lived there. Well, she hadn't lived there before, but Robert Kennedy hadn't lived there since he was a child. And nobody challenged that. I mean, there's no requirement of how long you have to live in a district or in a state before running.
Interestingly enough, in Britain, you don't have to live in the district you represent.
Really?
Yeah, you can
To
just.
me, just is so counterintuitive. Eric, you had a question.
It wasn't a question, it was a comment. 538 did a great series of both in podcasts and articles about redistricting. But one of their own people, Gail O'Drook and Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report. One of the things that they did was really interesting was that they showed, even if you just stay within the redistricting framework without going to sort of like proportional representation, which is a stretch. And Susie, we were talking, I asked Susie about the trouble is then you lose your connection to your own legislator.
Yeah.
Which is sort of,
Right.
but they were pointing out that, there are lots of good criteria for making redistricting seem more fair. Like Arizona appointed a commission and they tried to make it be competitive districts. Well, that really pissed off the Republicans big time. So they tried to disenfranchise the commission. California had a commission to redesign it, and they did a lot of things of they tried to make to respect sort of natural boundaries quite a bit. And that was, I think, their number one criterion, and they managed to sort of un-Jerry that. I think that's regarded as a pretty fair system. I've heard that the Washington State Commission, I think I heard Kevin Ranker say that the Washington one was unfortunately dominated, that the Republican people on the commission were just smarter than the Democrats.
Yes.
Didn't do a great job, but lots of different ways lots of different criteria that you could use in 538.
Okay, Sandy?
Well, it's something that, all of these ideas, some of them are really fascinating, and it would be interesting to try to expand on them and see the possibilities. But for an immediate effect on our elections, I think one of the most important things is to force states and districts to have convenient voting for people.
Yeah.
So people are not standing in line for 2 or 3 hours in the sun or the rain or whatever to vote. I think that should not be allowed. I don't know how you can force states to make it easy to vote. And I don't mean simple, but one shouldn't have to stand in line for hours in order to vote.
Yeah, that is going to, because the states determine how their voting structure is going to be, and it's going to take organizations like the League of Women Voters or other organizations taking action, to get legislation changed in each state. That was how we ended up with mail-in ballots, and which makes it mail-in registration. Oregon has gone to an automatic voter registration. Some states, like my home state, have made it harder to vote by requiring a picture ID before you can vote, and then they reduce the places you can get a picture ID. And there was a while back, I was in Alabama, and there was a bulletin, not a bulletin, but a big signs put up all over, and it said you need ID to vote, and it had a nice looking young black woman on it. That was all they had. They didn't have a white person or a young person or an old person, just this good looking black lady. And it was like it was a message there telling you that you had to have, what you had to do. Okay, question? Yes, Claire.
Since the league at the national level has come out with this position of wanting to do away with the Electoral College, do you think that's because part of their core mission is this one person, one vote?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes, I agree.
And I sort of think they have indicated that as being their reason for it.
Interestingly enough, there were a group of league members who created opposition arguments to the league position on the Electoral College. And they cited, and I won't go in all the details, but I can get this to anybody who's interested, constitutional issues, the problem of evaluating fairness, mechanical issues and possible flaws in some of the alternatives, and a whole host of issues that they felt need to be considered before getting rid of before adopting the National Popular Vote Compact. Yet they are advocating using that until such time as the Electoral College is abolished,
right, assuming
that we were going that direction. There is a Washington State redistricting group of the League of Women Voters, and Linnea Hurst, who many of you know as a former state president, is going around the state giving this, and what they have found in their investigation of our nonpartisan independent commission, or of our independent commission, which is definitely partisan, but that it is resulting in several unintended consequences, that they feel that the gerrymandering or that the redistricting in our state is not unbiased. And there are several other points. I was hoping to find my notes, but I can't find them. So I think there will be some push from the state league about changing even our supposedly squeakier clean than other states. There are basically 3 different kinds of redistricting commissions. There are the ones in 37 states that are done by the state legislators and legislatures. There are the independent commissions. There are only, I believe, 4 of those. There are 7 states that don't have to get into this because they only have 1 district, so they don't have to worry. And there are a smattering of a few smaller versions. But we are always held up as one of the states that has dealt with this problem, and I find it very interesting that our league is not feeling that we're living up to the stated issues of fairness, of being sure that minority constituents are fairly represented. What are the other criteria? We have about 4 criteria, and the league has proposed 3 new ones, which could help, whether it's an independent commission or some other completely nonpartisan commission that is eventually formed. And keep in mind, just because they're independent doesn't mean that it's not political, because 2 of the members are appointed by the Democrats, 2 by the Republicans, and the 5th member of our commission is chosen by those 4 members, is a non-voting member and expected to be neutral. But to say that ours is nonpartisan is not quite right.
Yeah, one of the things that came to mind as we talked about it, and the man that spoke and then is gone, some of the techniques we use for voting need to be adjusted. You know, another state where I lived was Louisiana, and they used to vote on voting machines, and they would vote on Saturday for anything other than a national election, and they left the voting machines in places because they didn't want to count them on Sunday. And by the time they went back and counted during one governor's election when we lived there, there had been a miscount from what was reported at the end of the day, and some of the machines actually counted 100 more. So voting machines can be tampered with, and Diebold, which you probably will see the name when you go to the automatic teller, makes voting machines. And I'm not saying anything about them, but that has been identified as something that could be controlled. We do need to have a uniform ballot, I think. And we need to have paper ballots that we can recount. And these are all things that, you know, it's going to take a national approach to do this. This is something we're going to have Congress to do this, and our Congress people need to be approached by citizens. We're kind of, it's real easy when you get a petition and you know, they'll sign this, you know, how many of you have signed at least a dozen petitions in the last week? You know, I'm all for police dogs and everything else. And, but we live in a state where most of us agree with what our state legislature and certainly what our wonderful governor does. I'm a big fan of the governor. But we need to have people we know to approach their own legislators. You know, right? I have people I send stuff to all the time who agree with me, and so I'm hoping they will take action as well. Other questions? Sorry, here.
I'm curious, how large a group is the league in the state? How many members do you have?
They're fairly close with those numbers. I'm not sure I could give you a figure. Marge, do you know? It's not a huge number, several thousand. We have chapters in, I think, virtually every county.
And nationally?
Nationally, several 100,000.
Yes, it's not a million, it's several 100,000.
We wish that it were a million. We think there should be a million members, male and female, minimum.
Do you allow male members?
Yes, we do.
We have, right there and there.
Raise your hand,
And there.
We've got 4 male members
No, we
right
throw
here
you out
today.
Thank you.
So you all come, including from Alaska. Okay, Eric?
Not to be grim, but isn't there about zero chance of reforming the Electoral College? I mean, one of the big political things that drove it in the first place is to empower small southern states. And the small states aren't going to let go of it anytime soon. You notice when you talk about the Voting Rights Compact, the people that have signed up already are pure blue states, the people that keep getting screwed with these elections and the national elections where we win the popular vote and the Republicans lose. The Republicans aren't going to go for this stuff anytime soon.
It's going to take citizen activism. You know, if enough people.
To say no.
What?
Takes only 13 states to say no, and the Electoral College stays as it is.
Yeah.
There are better ways to.
It's interesting, back when I was in high school, one of my favorite teachers, my government teacher, Mr. Turner, said, you know, we're going to have an election where the person who doesn't get the majority of the votes become president, and everybody's going to rise up and we're going to change it. Well, it hasn't yet. Happened twice. We've had 2 presidents that have been elected as recently as minority candidates. So, trying to spread the news. One of the nice things about having all the electronic media and stuff.
So as we said at the beginning, we're going to do a bibliography, and one of the ways you could use your voices is to send that bibliography around. When you're sitting over wine and cheese with your friends and you're talking gerrymandering, the Electoral College, you say, I've got this piece of paper you might be interested in. Whatever you can do to get people talking about it, no matter how you feel we should go. Keep the Electoral College, get rid of it, go to instant runoff voting. The important thing is to have the dialogue.
And some things get passed quickly, you know. So we're sorry about what happened with the Equal Rights Amendment, but there are a lot of things that have been passed. You know, a lot of constitutional amendments that have been passed. If there's a swelling of people, yes.
One of the problems with keeping it in the forefront is I was shocked at how many people after this last election didn't even know how Electoral College worked. They go, huh? You know, most people just don't get it.
Yeah.
I had a friend call me from Australia shortly after the 2016 election, and she said, quick, I'm going to my book club. Tell me how the Electoral College works. And I couldn't succinctly explain it to her. I could now, but I couldn't really. And I realized the extent to which, you know snippets of it, but who it's composed of and how it functions is something that we all sort of should understand so we can decide whether or not we want to keep it or get rid of it. And just because it's a long process doesn't mean it's not valuable.
Not doable.
Or not doable. Emily?
It's just a bit of history, tally with what Laura said. When I was in high school in the 50s, the national debate topic was resolved that the Electoral College should be abolished.
Really? Are you going to tell us how many years ago that was?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, the 50s.
Who won the debate is more the question.
Pardon?
Who won the debate, the pros or the cons?
Well, who had the most of those 3x5 note cards?
Right.
Remember that well. Yeah, the thing about it is, yes.
I'm
Susie?
just wondering, after the students did their demonstration on gun control issues, what is the chance of taking a program like you two have done and offer it to the high school year after year so the kids can learn more than, we have an electoral college in our country, and this is kind of how it works in 5 minutes. And then we don't really know. But if, starting way down with the kids so they can grow up learning more about this. And,
I think
know
reaching
they've
out
got
to the schools is something we have done periodically and will continue to do until we get their support
Yeah,
or can get our curriculum.
The state of Washington doesn't require a separate government class. They say it's included in the U.S. history class.
That's not true now, though. They just passed it this
Did they?
time.
Oh, well,
Yes.
thank you. I'm sorry, I'm
It is
glad to be
required.
corrected. I know the state.
Civics is required now.
That's great, thank you. I know that the high school teaches a government class. And matter of fact, I borrowed some material from the teacher. Other questions? Are you all tired and want to go home now?
Hot.
Okay, everybody, thank you.